You recently wrote regarding the debt crisis, facing down the military-industrial lobby is the vital first step in putting America's fiscal house in order. Let's start there. Why do you think that's the first thing or spending you would attack to restore sort of fiscal sanity?
Well, we've just been in one war after another. The military budget is out of sight, and it's got a lot of bipartisan support for even more spending. So I regard this as something we actually should think about after wasting so much money in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and now Ukraine. Maybe there could be some sensible discussion. But the way our government works is that each part of public policy, so-called, is parceled out to special lobbies. This one goes to the military-industrial complex. It's got a strong constituency in Congress, and there's really no debate about any of this stuff. So that was really the purpose of the article, to say, look, we've spent maybe 6 to 8 trillion by now on these wasted wars. We never look backwards in this country. You know, that's part of our national trait. Never think about what just happened. Just plow ahead. And 6 to 8 trillion, by I think a reasonable calculation, is perhaps half of the total increase of the publicly held debt from 2000 till now. I show a little arithmetic on that point. And so we ought to contemplate, we're deep in another wasteful and destructive effort, and we should sort this out.
So just for the purposes of the discussion and some pushback, we have an ascendant China spending more and more money on its military. Even places like Saudi Arabia they're increasing their military budget 16% a year. We have obviously a very aggressive Russia, a land war in Europe. Is this a time to be cutting military spending? Or, I mean, there's the efficiency. Are there better ways to spend the money? And then there's the overall budget. But at, 12 or 13% of our budget, is military spending really the place to start in terms of fiscal responsibility?
Yeah, it is. We all know the prisoner's dilemma situation, where it's individually rational, say, for the U.S. to engage in an arms race, and maybe individually rational for China to engage in an arms race, and yet the outcome is absurd for both countries and very dangerous, actually. The way you get out of a prisoner's dilemma is you actually talk with each other, and that's the one thing we're not allowed to do right now. So the whole setup of how we think about these things is phony, to my mind, first of all, and extremely destructive. The idea of the prisoner's dilemma, which we teach in school to our students year after year for the last 70 years, is that if you don't talk to the other side and realize that you're stuck, it's called a dilemma because you're stuck with a terrible outcome, you'll end up with that outcome. But we could actually talk to the other side and say, this mutual arms race is really absurd. Of course, China thinks they're just being defensive because they say, look, we're spending 1/3 of what the United States spends. You go to Washington, which unfortunately I have to do once in a while, and listen to these politicians, and it's drumbeats of war everywhere. And so the Chinese say, well, we've got to do this. This is our defense. And then the United States says, oh, China's increasing its spending. We need to do the same thing. That's a prisoner's dilemma. But I would say for Americans, it's good to know we're spending 3 times more than the Chinese right now. The U.S. military spending is more than the next 10 countries combined. If you want to get a good recent accounting of this, there's an organization in Stockholm, Stockholm Institute of Peace Research. I have it wrong. Somehow I've dropped an I in that. It's SIPRI, but you can find it online. Their recent report showing $2.2 trillion of military spending. The United States is 40% of the world total, though we are 4% of the world population. I think we've got some scope to do this in a more rational way.
So I think that's a really important point, and it's funny you're saying that because I have in front of me the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and just to look at some of the numbers, United States spends 877 billion, China number two spends 292, and if you look at the top 10 spenders, I think you'd argue six or seven of the 10 that were allies. That even the 877 number is a bit misleading because if you think about Western or OECD countries that are largely coordinating with each other, we dwarf the rest. And your belief is that if we sat down and said, okay, China and Russia, and I don't know if you consider India and Saudi Arabia sort of swing votes, this is out of control. We all have better ways to spend our money, similar to what we did with nuclear arms or nuclear missiles, where we took them from 50,000 to 10,000. We're all going to start reducing our military budget. Would that be a good starting place?
I think a really good starting place would be the idea that first, we shouldn't be aiming to blow each other up, because behind all of this is even a more destructive point than the budget, which is the mindset. The mindset right now in the U.S. is China's an enemy. War is very likely, which is, I can't even believe that, but that's actually what is thought in Washington, that war is likely. And this mindset that we're aiming or we're heading for conflict is relatively new, extraordinarily wrong-headed, easily avoidable. You know, a good way to avoid it is for Nancy Pelosi not to fly to Taiwan, for example. I mean, you don't just stick the thumb in the eye of your counterpart and expect everything's going to work out fine. You don't freeze dialogue like the Biden administration did when it came into office. You know, there was an order in the government: don't talk to your Chinese counterparts. That was for most of the first year of the administration. You don't say, we're cutting you off from all advanced technology in every way we can, and roll out the old containment playbook and expect that you're going to have any kind of peaceful relations. So I think even deeper than the budget issue, though the way you put it is exactly right, is a mindset issue. We're in the prisoner's dilemma in a most naive way, which is we know that they are going to be aggressive, so we're going to be aggressive back. And that's the mindset right now. And it's completely wrong-headed.
Do you think some of this chill, though, in U.S.-China relations is, I think China, I used to go to China a lot, and I think of or China is a different place than it was 10 years ago, and that Xi's rise to power, that it's an autocracy, that they've actually been quite aggressive, and that us going to Taiwan, who has been an ally, a strategic ally, we do great trade with them, and that no one should intimidate us into having our representatives visit Taiwan. It just strikes me that you're not holding both parties accountable for the chill here in relations.
No, I think it's actually something different, which is more kind of international realist approach, which is that starting around 2012, you could really date it to around 2014, China reached a new level of its economic development. You know, during the period from 1980 to 2010, arguably, China became the world's manufacturing workshop. But the idea was, okay, we have the technologies, they have the low-cost labor, and this is a great relationship. We're going to get a lot of low-cost iPhones out of this, and this is good. But Chinese are extremely clever and extremely capable. They started minting hundreds of thousands of PhDs per year. And what really freaked out the American policymakers was two things that came around 2014. I'd say number one was a program in China called Made in China 2025, where China used terms that I would not have advised them to use, but they said, we're going to, I don't know if it's dominate, but we're going to be the major players in a lot of key technologies by 2025. So that was one thing, and it really freaked out Washington. And the second was the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Belt and Road Initiative was China saying, we're the phenomenal world savers, while the United States barely saves. We save 40% of our gross domestic product or more. And we're going to use those savings to build highways, fast rail, 5G, all over Eurasia. And by the way, even in East Africa, Latin America, and that's the Belt and Road Initiative. We don't have any initiatives like that. 50 years ago, we would have, but now the United States doesn't. So these two things were kind of an announcement. China's reaching a level of superpower status in the world, and a superpower of 1.4 billion people and a highly successful society. At that point, you start finding remarkable statements. It didn't have to do with Xi. It didn't have to do with anything specific about putting up some military facilities on a tiny island in the South China Sea. Nothing like that. It had to do with the recognition that China was now a threat to U.S. dominance. And there's a remarkable paper by a former colleague of mine, Ambassador Robert Blackwell, who wrote, I think it's 2015, the Council on Foreign Relations, people can download it, that the United States needs to rethink its relations with China because China is now a threat to U.S. predominance or U.S. dominance. And he lays out a number of steps in that paper very clearly. We need to restrict technology flows. We need to organize countries in Asia to engage and trade with us in ways that deliberately exclude the Chinese from any role in policymaking. And he lays out quite explicitly a kind of neo-containment strategy, if I could call it that. So that's when the U.S. started to move. It started under Trump, but Biden has accelerated it. And I think it's just wrong to think that somehow this was provoked by Xi. It was provoked by China's continued rise in excellence, in innovation, in science and technology. And it was provoked by the good old U.S. idea that, hey, this is our century, nobody else's century, and we're not going to let it happen. Now, I happen to think that's a ridiculous approach to life because as an economist, I guess, maybe as a human being, I believe in win-win ideas. I don't believe that this is really a game of who's on top, but actually, are we prospering, which is not a zero-sum idea, but more of a shared idea. And I regard that whole shift in U.S. politics as being dangerous and wrong-headed, sure to create an enemy of the other side. And just if I could, finish on this thought, one of my favorite political scientists is John Mearsheimer, who is our kind of go-to super realist at the University of Chicago. And he wrote a very powerful, very influential book in the early 2000s called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And in the early 2000s, when he wrote, he said, it looks calm right now. It looks like, we're past great power crisis. But he writes very presciently, when China grows in power, we're going to be right back to great power conflict. And I give him a lot of credit for it. But I said to him, John, this is going to lead to self-fulfilling crisis. He said, yes. I said, John, that's a tragedy. Yes. He said, that's how it is. And I don't accept that part, that we have to have a tragic outcome to all of this. Well, I think it should be, first of all, friendly. Second, the big thing about the U.S. that is really important to understand, we've been the imperium. In fact, we viewed ourselves as the empire. Empires tend to rule by divide et impera, meaning divide and conquer, divide and rule. And so the United States, in region after region of the world, has actually pressed division. This may be counterintuitive, but we like to stir up trouble in regions and pit countries against each other so that some come running under our wing. And so the reason that I say this is that what has the U.S. done in the Middle East since 1978? In 1978, 79, Zbig Brzezinski had the idea. He was a clever person, but this was a pretty world-changing step. He said, we're going to provoke the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan. We're going to do it by funding jihadists, the Mujahideen, and that's going to cause the Soviets to come in, and we're going to trap them in a war by funding jihadists fighting the Soviet-backed government of Afghanistan. So we did that, typical CIA operation. I'd say 44 years later, one of the great disasters of all time, and boomeranged on us incredibly. Okay, that was one thing in 1979, triggering what turned out to be more than 4 decades of war in Afghanistan, leaving that country in complete ruins. Same time, that was the Iranian crisis. We decided we'd kill the new Islamic regime of Iran. So from 1980 onward, we funded Iraq, Saddam, to fight a absolutely bloody war throughout the 1980s with Iran. And then we took every step to do everything we could to kill the Iranian regime from then until now with just a few tiny iterations. Then in 2011, Hillary Clinton and Obama got the not so bright idea in their head. Why don't we overthrow Bashar al-Assad? And we unleashed the so-called Syrian civil war. It was really a CIA-backed operation to overthrow the Syrian government. I mention all of this in the context of your question because Saudi Arabia knows we've been everywhere meddling and stirring up trouble all over this region from the Middle East, the Gulf, and Western Asia. In fact, all of the major players know it. Iran, Turkey, the Saudis, and so forth, the Egyptians, and so on. So what's happened recently is that China stepped in to do something absolutely dazzling and completely beyond the imagination of an American strategist. And that is that the Chinese brought the Iranians and the Saudis together to make peace. Unbelievable, by the way. You wouldn't have found 1 in 1,000 in Washington that would have said, it's not even possible. What do the Chinese know about this? And the Saudis and Iranians. Our whole game plan was based on that supposed Sunni-Shia conflict being unresolvable. And the Chinese resolved it. The Chinese brought Bashar al-Assad back into the Arab League at the meeting, and he was at the meeting just a couple of days ago, reaccepted. So if you ask how the Saudis view the United States right now, they view the United States as saying, God, this is a country that is just enmeshed in conflict, and actually we need to get moving to something bigger at this point. So unless the United States changes its approach, I don't think it's going to play in the Middle East. I think the countries in the Middle East are, frankly, a little bit tired of all of the wars that the U.S. has stirred up.
So, Jeff, let's discuss the war in Ukraine. You believe the U.S. government is falsely claiming that this war started with an, open quote, unprovoked attack by Russia, close quote. And then in reality, we should be recognizing the role that NATO enlargement has played. Say more?
Well, back in 1990, Gorbachev, who was a kind of dream for the world to end the Cold War peacefully, said, I'm going to disband the Warsaw Pact military alliance. And James Baker III and Hans Dietrich Genscher jumped in and said, if you do that, we promise NATO won't move 1 inch eastward. And there's a great archival summary of all of that collected by George Washington University National Archives Project that shows how many times NATO leaders, US leaders, German leaders told Gorbachev and then told Yeltsin, okay, no NATO enlargement. Of course, by 1992, when the Soviet Union was no more, our neocons, and at that point it was Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, started planning NATO enlargement. I mean, our promises lasted a nanosecond in a historical time. And I spoke with a historian, leading historian recently. I won't say his name because he hasn't published this work yet, but he was telling me that in the archives, he finds records already in 1992 that the intention is that NATO will expand to Ukraine. It's incredible to my mind. So in 1997's Big Brzezinski spells out in Foreign Affairs the timeline for NATO enlargement, and he gets it almost exactly because he wasn't surmising what it should be. He was reporting, of course, what the inside plan was in Washington and letting the foreign affairs community around the Council on Foreign Relations understand what all this was about. And from the mid-1990s, this became a public debate because a lot of people told Clinton, including America's leading diplomats, don't do that. This will provoke a new Cold War. And even Bill Perry, Clinton's Secretary of Defense, thought about resigning in protest over Clinton's, and it was Madeleine Albright and the Democratic Party neocons. Don't do this. This is absolutely reckless. Well, what happened, as we now know, and it was just like Zbig said it and wrote in 1997, the NATO enlargement went in 3 stages. First stage was Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. Second stage under George W. Bush Jr. was in 2004, 7 more countries right up to Russia's border, but in this case with the Baltic states. So it was Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and then on the Black Sea, Romania and Bulgaria, and then Slovenia and Slovakia. Putin gives a famous speech in the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where he says, would you stop it? This is a threat to our core national security. Do not move any closer. Well, 2008, the neocon agenda continued just on track. Victoria Nuland, by the way, who's now our Undersecretary of State and is probably the single continuity of the American deep state in both political parties, because she was Cheney's advisor, then she was ambassador to NATO in 2008, and now she's Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. In 2008, George W. pushed that at the Bucharest NATO summit, we would commit to NATO enlarging to Ukraine and to Georgia. And this really freaked out the Russians, because if you look at the map, what we were literally doing was surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. The idea was Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, exactly the countries that surround the naval base in Sevastopol, would all be NATO members. And Putin told Bush then in Bucharest, because the day after the NATO conference, there was a NATO Russia meeting. He said, if you do this, this is likely to go terribly wrong. Well, what I saw was what happened next, which is that a pro-Russian president of Ukraine was elected, Viktor Yanukovych. He said, we need neutrality between the two sides. And neutrality was against the neocon purpose. And when protests erupted against Yanukovych in late 2013, there was Victoria Nuland flying back and forth nonstop to Kiev to help orchestrate what turned out to be a violent overthrow of Yanukovych in February 2014. That's when the war began. And I know we were very deeply involved in what was essentially a coup. And Yanukovych left. A Russophobic series of governments came in, all wanting NATO membership. And at the end of 2021, just to bring us up to the current moment, Putin put a diplomatic initiative on the table on December 17, 2021, actually a draft agreement between Russia and the United States on security matters. And I read it. I thought, yeah, this is absolutely the right basis for a diplomatic outcome. I actually called the White House and had a long talk with one of the top people and said, negotiate, for heaven's sake. You know, what Putin's put on the table is absolutely reasonable because NATO enlargement to Ukraine could get us all blown up. No, Jeff, it's got nothing to do with this. And anyway, NATO's an open door. And if Ukraine wants it, we're not going to stop it. Just baloney, by the way, complete baloney, as if the United States would say to Mexico, yeah, if you want to have a military alliance with Russia or China, that's just fine with us. Or say that to Canada. You know, you can imagine what would happen here if anybody tried that unwise step. Well, we told Putin point blank in January 22, we will not discuss with you the issue of NATO enlargement because it has nothing to do with you. We will not allow any third country, meaning you, have any say over where NATO goes. And if you read the minutes of the Russian National Security Council meeting of February 21st or Putin's speech to the nation that night, they said, look, we tried diplomacy. We tried to discuss this. We got the door slammed in our face, and we're not going to tolerate NATO on our 1,900 kilometer border with Ukraine. So to my mind, Biden blew it badly. And we're at war now, and they still won't admit the truth. And one of the things I wrote in that article, Scott, is we can't barely get a discussion in this country going. I tried actually to publish something in the New York Times. They wouldn't take it in the end after they accepted it. They accepted it, then they said, nah, we're not going to really run it. I said, come on, you guys are writing all the time that this is an unprovoked war. This was provoked. You need to run something. Yeah, maybe, I don't know. So this is why it's so hard to have an actual debate in this country. It's an inside job, and it's dangerous. So that's really the point of my article.
I do want to push back a little bit on, I do believe that NATO, I don't think that NATO nor the West has any designs on invading Russia. I can understand why they're threatened, but I do believe that, let's talk about here we are. Here we are in a land war, and let's be honest, with NATO in Ukraine. And my sense is the best way to end this war, quite frankly, is to win it. And that if Russia wants to leave, it's over. And that if they don't leave, or that we come to some sort of accommodation where they get land for invading and killing as many people, you know, obviously a lot of their own people have perished, doesn't that send a green light to autocrats all over the world that they have a strategic advantage, or that it's in their best interest to invade their neighbors? I mean, distinct of how we got here, isn't really the only viable way out, or the best way out for Western interests and democracies all over the world, is to convince the Russians to leave?
Well, they're not going to leave because they, or let me put it this way. The answer is yes to your question. If we said, if you leave, we don't come in. That's the magic word. If we said, you leave and NATO doesn't enlarge, we have a real chance. That was what was on offer in December 2021. But we said, you leave and we'll do what we want. And that's just not going to happen. That's the problem. So if we said, you leave and we won't enter the gap, I think that is absolutely a viable basis for negotiations. So my point is, in December 2021, Putin was not looking to annex these 4 regions that are now annexed, which made everything much more complicated. Now, mind you, there's also a real complication, and maybe if we have another few hours, we can talk about Crimea, because that actually is a quite complicated subject. But just to say, your basic approach is the one I take, but I add an important footnote, which is, yeah, Russia should go home, but we agree that NATO won't go in. That line I've been urging for years. The White House explicitly won't say it for a real reason, which is that Victoria Nuland has been on this jag for almost 30 years, probably. And certainly, we know from the late 1990s, they want NATO to expand. And here's the point. Obama knew in 2014, he actually gave an interview for which he was heavily criticized. He gave an interview that said, I don't want to get into this more because Russia has escalatory dominance. And what he meant by that is whatever we do, they can take it up a notch, up to nuclear war. And they care about this a hell of a lot more than we do. So I don't want to take the first step and then have my have the pot raised by the Russians, and then we match or raise and go on, because they can keep doing this. They will not allow NATO to expand to Ukraine. To my mind, that's been the story all along.
So, Jeff, you've been generous with your time. I just have one last question. We've kind of done a whirlwind tour geopolitically. I know you speak to a lot of people at the highest levels. So let's do the magic wand question. The president or the White House or Congress only has the bandwidth or the ability to get 2 or 3 things done. What do you think are the most important initiatives that we can take here in the U.S. to ensure not only continued prosperity, but progress?
You know, the key to prosperity is investment. We don't invest enough in this country. Our domestic investment rate, it's not properly measured, but even if you add in the R&D, you add in the fixed investment, and you add in the education spending, it's a shadow of what it should be, because we've got between 1/3 and 1/2 of this country basically outside of the education and even the physical infrastructure increasingly for a prosperous life. And that's where our real issues are. It's a great country. We should invest in it. And that's where we should be putting our public finances. That's where we should be putting our efforts. That's where companies should be devoting their time, not fighting over Ukraine, not having a world war threat over Taiwan, not having 800 military bases around the world, all huge anachronisms. The impressive thing about the United States in the last 30 years, the most positive economic point, and it's a surprise for me if I think back 30 years, we really sustained the technology investments. In fact, not just sustained them, we increased them. And the payoffs have been huge. Our R&D spending is big and wonderful, and it's actually generating huge amounts of new technology. But then we don't invest in the people. We don't invest in basic health care. We don't invest in poor people and poor communities. We don't even have a concept of social housing. I've been spending a lot of time in Vienna this year, which is magnificent and has, 100 years of tradition of social housing. We don't even have the concept right now in this country. And this war stuff is a complete drain. So what I said to the administration at the beginning, though they could care less what I said, but I said, don't do foreign theatrics. Don't get entangled even more. Build this country peacefully. And there's enough for the whole world to have a mutual benefit. Don't break trade. Don't break agreements. Don't contain China. What a waste of time for us. Let's invest in the United States. So that would be my answer. Well, great to be with you, first of all, and thanks for a discussion of a really important topic because nobody has quite explained in this debate, whether it's the White House or the Congress, how we got to the situation that we're in. Here are the basic numbers. If you look at the debt that the government owes to the public, not that the government owes to other units of the government, it's something around $25 trillion, not quite the 31 trillion, because some of that is owed to the Federal Reserve, for example. Okay, these are technicalities. 25 trillion is still a big number, and it's nearly 100% of our annual output in the country, which is the gross domestic product. Now, back in the year 2000, the debt that was owed by the government was only 35% of the gross domestic product. So it went from being 35% of national income back in the year 2000 to nearly 100% of our national income today. That's a pretty steep increase. That means that we are spending, but not covering that spending by taxes, but covering that spending by borrowing. And obviously, we've been borrowing a lot. The point of my article is that really a lot of that borrowing has gone to fund these useless, wasteful, destructive wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, now Ukraine. That's awful. And when you look at the estimates by the Watson Institute at Brown University, they say that the cost of these wars is about $8 trillion if you combine them, not even up to today, but up to a couple of years ago. Now, there are some definitional issues and some timing issues that mean that we should go a little bit deeper at the technical level. But the point is that if we had kept our debt at 35% of GDP rather than at 100% of GDP, that is about 65% of GDP, or 2/3 of today's GDP of 24 trillion. You do the arithmetic, that's about a $16 trillion, $15 to $16 trillion increase of debt beyond what would have kept the debt at a level relative to income. So what the Watson Institute estimates are showing is that about half of that has gone to war. I think even more than half has really accounted for by the military, because in addition to the war spending, we're funding 800 military bases around the world. We're funding a bloated intelligence world. We're funding all sorts of things that the military-industrial complex likes, that Raytheon or General Dynamics or Boeing or those that are selling weapons like, but are a waste for the American people. Now, mind you, the other half of that increase of debt came from the 2008 financial crisis, which blew a hole in the budget. That was Wall Street excess, let me put it that way. Another part came from the pandemic. Various things could be said about that. But basically, between war, financial crisis, and the pandemic, that's where our budget was blown. And here's the challenge I would put to President Biden. I'm completely against what we're doing in Ukraine because I think this war could have been avoided. I think it has a lot to do with the U.S. relentless push to expand NATO, which, by the way, is a military-industrial complex lobbying goal. That's what they lobby for. They love selling weapons to new NATO members. They want to keep expanding NATO. And other countries, including Russia, say, stop coming up to our border. Okay, so I think this war could have been avoided, but Biden really is part of the military-industrial complex, has been as a senator, a vice president, now as president. He's always backed NATO enlargement. He's backed NATO enlargement to Ukraine. I think it's been reckless. I think it's the reason we have this war. So I'm saying, okay, if you really want to make a deal, stop this wasteful spending, get the military budget under control. But by the way, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are talking about this almost at all.
Yes, it's up to us, right?
They're gonna slash the social safety net, which is already in tatters in this country, and then protect the military spending.
Well,
so that we can have more war.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to ask you about, Jeffrey Sachs, because I know that at one point during this debt crisis, Republicans were adamant about reducing spending. We even had our House Speaker, I'll put that in quotes, Kevin McCarthy promised the Freedom Caucus and promised the American people that we would not issue a blank check for Ukraine. And now we're up to over $115 billion. Half of that, an estimated half, for weapons and military training. The latest being that the U.S., Biden has agreed that the United States will train Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16 fighter jets.
Unbelievable, because it's nonstop escalation. More weapon systems, more destruction, more deaths, more spending. And I remember what I wanted to say, which is I would challenge President Biden, if he wants to continue on this path of the Ukraine war, which I think is tragic and completely solvable if he would stop the NATO enlargement and say to the Russians, go home and we don't go into Ukraine. And that's how you end this war. But I'd like him to say, okay, if we're going to spend more money, we're going to raise taxes to do it. Let's put it to the American people. Fund this, not just put it on the debt. And I'd say to the Republicans also, you want the war? Tell the American people they're going to pay more taxes. You want to have a war in Asia with China? Okay, raise the taxes for that. See how the American people feel about that. They don't dare do it. That's why the debt keeps going up, because these wars are not popular at all. And by the way, they don't want to ask the American people their views about anything. So they just put it onto the debt without asking us, do we really want to have this tragic war in Iraq? Do we really want to have a CIA-led operation to overthrow the Syrian government? Do we really want to bomb Libya back into rubble? They never asked us on any of this stuff. And if they just put it onto the debt, but if they said, okay, this is really important, and we're going to raise taxes to do it, then we could have a good debate in this country. Is this really important, or is this good for General Dynamics? Is this good for Boeing? Is this good for the military-industrial complex? We don't have that debate right now because they hide it on the debt.
That's right. And few people realize that the Department of Defense, the Department of War, it used to be called, it should still be called, has never passed an audit. That's because there's missing money and people can't explain where this money has gone. And now we're just hurling money, spending about $6 billion to prop up the government in Ukraine, rather than saying, we'll support a ceasefire, we'll sit down, we'll negotiate with Putin, with Zelensky, maybe have two tracks of diplomacy, but we want to end this war now. No, instead, Biden has committed the United States to train Ukrainian pilots on these F-16 fighter jets, which could take a year or two. I mean, that's in essence saying we're committed to further death, destruction, the risk of nuclear war for another 2 years. But let's get back for a minute to the so-called debt crisis, because you're an economist, Jeffrey Sachs. I want answers to a couple questions in the weeds. Okay. So we have this, you say it's a $24 trillion debt. If you really examine it, the media is saying $31 trillion. Anyway, the point is, where are we getting this money? It's debt. Who do we owe it to? How are we raising this money to pay for all of these wars, including the war in Ukraine?
So the government borrows. It borrows from the public. It borrows from foreign governments that hold this debt. It borrows from foreign wealth holders that owe this debt. And to some extent, the borrowing is okay, but we went from owing 35% of our income to 100% of our gross domestic product. And what the Congressional Budget Office signals is that if we keep on the current policies, the debt will rise to around 160% or even higher of our gross domestic product by mid-century. In other words, we're on an upward spiral because no side, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, want to talk about spending to cover wars and the military budget. Neither one wants to talk about taxing the rich. By the way, that's true not just of the Republicans who fight that, the Democrats fight that. President Biden announces for re-election, and where does he go immediately? To wealthy donors. He goes to Wall Street. This is both parties. Come on. This is why the rich don't pay taxes. So we're on a spiraling rise of debt. You can carry some debt. We all, carry a mortgage maybe if you own a home. Some people have consumer debt and so forth, but you keep it under a limit so that it doesn't get out of hand. And for a while, the interest rates were very, very low. So the government said, oh, look, we can borrow. It doesn't matter. We'll just keep borrowing. But you know what? It turned into inflation. Now the interest rates are going up because the Fed is once again raising interest rates to try to staunch inflation. And suddenly the debt service burden, in other words, how much we have to pay on just interest on this debt, is rising by percentage points of GDP, eating up invaluable tax revenues that we need to help educate our kids, for normal society, for fighting the pandemics and the mental health and the crime and other things that we have a social safety net for, but it's now going to go to debt service. And that is why you keep your debt under control, so that when you collect revenues, you can use it for the important things, not simply to pay interest on what you borrowed in the past.
Now, when we're paying this interest, Jeffrey Sachs, are we paying this interest to Japan, a large holder of U.S. debt, to China, another large holder of U.S. debt? Did they buy treasury bonds? Is that the debt that we're talking about?
Yeah, we pay the interest on anyone that holds U.S. Treasury bills and bonds. That includes a lot of foreign governments, as you've mentioned. It includes a lot of wealthy people in the United States. It includes a lot of pension funds, insurance funds, money market funds backed up by U.S. Treasury bills. The government borrows by selling its bills and bonds in a kind of open market that any wealth holder can buy to include in their wealth or their asset portfolio. So it's wealth holders all over the world of all kinds, from pension funds and insurance funds and money market funds and foreign exchange reserves of other governments. The point from our governmental point of view is that's okay if it's 35% of GDP, even if it's 50% of GDP. By the way, it's okay if it went up to 100% of GDP and we had used the difference for making wonderful investments that were going to boost the economy. But where did that increase of debt come from? That 16 trillion that I talked about, what was it used for? Was it used for modernizing our infrastructure and making everything work well in the US? No, it went to wars, down the drain. It went to the veterans spending for all the wounded soldiers that suffered from this, a huge bill, human disaster, financial and fiscal disaster. It went also for this Wall Street debacle in 2008 when they were playing games with subprime mortgages, and we ended up with a massive recession. And it went to the spending on the COVID pandemic. And so we don't have the infrastructure or the investment, the physical capital, as the counterpart of all that borrowing. We have a lot of waste. It's very sad. We ran up the debt and we have nothing to show for it except, my God, why did we do that?
Well, I think we did it because the Capitol has really been invaded by lobbyists for military contractors. They're the most powerful, as you mentioned in your article in Common Dreams, the most powerful lobbying group. I imagine the oil industry, fossil fuel industry is right up there as well with Big Pharma. But by and large, we have a captive Congress. So here's my question to talk about the debt just a little bit more. With us owing something like over $800 billion in interest to China, how is it that we have all these lawmakers who are saying that we need to prepare for war with China? I was listening to a hearing in the House the other day, and I couldn't believe I couldn't believe what they were saying about sending more and more troops over to the Pacific to surround China. I think we already have about 250 bases. We're opening a new base in Guam, sending 5,000 Marines from Okinawa to Guam, fully militarizing Guam. And yet we owe China money. How do they square this in their mind?
Well, I can tell you I've been engaged in international economics at the professional level for 43 years, and you add some student years in that. I've never seen a worse public discussion and debate than we have right now. It's almost mindless. It's also filled with lies and many other things, but this warmongering against China it's so wrong, by the way. Aside from the question of debt, do we really want to end the world? Do we really want to have World War III with China right now? These congressmen need to get a life, get out of their handouts and hands out to the military industrial funders and the other lobbyists, and go learn something. Go to China, go have some discussions, go see something, because what they're talking is nonsense, and it's going to get us in deep, deep trouble. So when it comes to the question of the drumbeats of war with China, much more than the debt issue and the economy issue, I'm worried about the survival issue. And I just see so much ignorance in Congress, but maybe it's not ignorance. Maybe they're just expert at fundraising for their reelection campaigns, and that's all that matters to them. But I don't think they know what they're talking about at all right now.
Well, I would agree with you on that. I think many of us at Code Pink would agree with you. And there are some of us who believe that this war in Ukraine is really a prelude to what people like Victoria Nuland, number 3 in the State Department, who was there in the Maidan Square in 2014, encouraging the coup and engineered the transition government, want to see, which is the next war with China. God forbid, right? We know that would be an absolute disaster.
Overseas, a lot of people call this the Nuland administration, not the Biden administration, because Nuland has been there. She was Cheney's advisor. She was the Bush ambassador to NATO when the NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia was put. This disastrous idea that got us into this was put into the NATO agenda, by the way, over the huge objections of the Europeans at the time. She was the ambassador to NATO under the Republicans. Okay, then she stays, and then she's the point person for the U.S. role in the overthrow of the Ukraine government in February 2014 that starts this war, because people need to remember, just get on a website and look at it. Even they're admitting it. This war didn't start in 2022 with Russia's invasion. This war started in 2014 with the violent overthrow of the Ukraine government. And go listen to Nuland on tape several weeks before the overthrow, talking about who the next government would be in Ukraine. She's already plotting this with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piot, on a phone call that was intercepted. It's unbelievable. She was then Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Now she's Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. So she's that deep state, the one that transcends the political parties, that shows this is not Democrats and Republicans. This goes back to Cheney, to Bush. This goes to Obama administration. This goes right up to Biden. Come on. What is this? And we've known all along. Our own diplomats, William Burns, who in 2008 was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, cabled home, and people can find it online because it was covered by WikiLeaks. They can find William Burns' email cable that says, my God, if we push NATO enlargement, this is absolutely a Russian red line. And the Russians have explained, don't do this, why this is so dangerous. And Nuland, okay, close your eyes, just go ahead, everything will be fine. And not everything's fine. Now we're in the middle of one war and at risk of another war, and nothing is fine.